Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the History in 20 podcast. And today we have a very special guest, Dr. Carlos Conde Solares, who is Programme Leader for BA History at Northumbria University in Newcastle. So his interests lay largely in late medieval Spain with a focus on interactions between the spiritual systems of Christianity, Judaism and Islam. Carlos has also appeared as a guest in Al Jazeera, France 24, TRT, amongst other TV channels. And as well as being a well-respected published academic, he's also written opinion pieces in El Mundo, The Globe Post, Chronica Popular, The Conversation, and more. So welcome to the podcast, Carlos. It's great to have you here.
I'm delighted to be here with you, Chester. Thank you very much for having me.
No problem at all. So today we're going to be discussing Christopher Columbus and sort of who he was and the discovery, in inverted commas, of the Americas. So the first question I have, and I think a lot of viewers, listeners will probably have as well, is who was Christopher Columbus, Carlos? Who was he?
Well, that's a very difficult question to begin with, because as you know, Christopher Columbus is a very mysterious character. We know relatively little about him, and it is quite a peculiarity when it comes to studying this particular historical character. It seems to be very from the minutes that we have of the courts of Castile and the way that he introduces himself, we know that he has some very powerful connections in the court of Castile. The Duke of Medina Celi seems to know him well. Some of the higher advisors of the Catholic monarchs seem to know who this guy is, but we don't know much about his family, and we do know about his descendants. And this in part because one of his ambitions was to build a lineage for him, that is, was to leave a legacy for his family, which leads me to think that perhaps he came from a relatively low social extraction. There are several theories about where Christopher Columbus was from. The most popular one is that he was from Genoa, from Italy, and this is purely because he was a sailor, and a lot of sailors were from Genoa at this time. When we look at his actual writings, when we look at his logbooks, many of which have actually been transcribed by other people later on, which makes it a little bit difficult to gather where he was from through his language, we see that he's someone who seems to speak and who seems to write in a sort of universal international type of Spanish that was fairly common amongst the people of the sea. That is, there are terms in Portuguese, there are terms in Catalan, there are terms in Italian, but in general, it's quite difficult to place Christopher Columbus and to know who he was exactly, which makes him all the more fascinating as well.
Definitely, yeah, that was a great answer. So for anyone who might not know, the sort of period we're talking about is like the late 15th century here, obviously 1492 being the key year. And another key couple of figures from that era and that year in particular were the Catholic monarchs in Spain at the time. So I just wondered if you could talk us through who those Catholic monarchs were.
Right, so Fernando II of Aragon, and Isabel of Castile, the Catholic monarchs, were responsible for bringing together the Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula in 1492, putting an end to Al-Andalus with the fall of Granada on the 2nd of January of that same year of 1492, also with the Alhambra Decree, which meant the end of Judaism in the Iberian Peninsula, also in 1492, and finally on the 12th of October, by sponsoring that expedition by Christopher Columbus that ends up in America. The first expedition of Columbus ends up in the Bahamas on the 12th of October of 1492. A lot of things happen in 1492 under the reign of the Catholic monarchs, who are also responsible under their watch for the establishment in 1478 of the Spanish branch of the Inquisition. Perhaps the most powerful of late medieval, early modern monarchs, and two characters that are also very, very interesting because neither of them was meant to be the heir to their throne. In the case of Fernando of Aragon, it was meant to be his half brother Carlos of Viana to inherit the kingdom. In the case of Isabel, she arrives in the throne because of a conspiracy against her, against Enrique IV, who's deemed incapable of ruling, and Isabel is placed there as a young woman in place of him. the nobility expecting her to be a sort of puppet that they could rule, and ending up being completely the opposite. That is one of the most characterful monarchs of the medieval early modern period. Two incredibly interesting characters, both of them, and two characters that had a very powerful set of propagandists writing for them as well. So we have both a historical image of the Catholic monarchs, but also very much a romantic one.
That's another great answer, as per, yeah. And I know you mentioned they sponsored his voyage, Christopher Columbus's voyage. So why did they sponsor his expedition, and why did they choose him in particular to sponsor his voyage to the Americas, or his voyage of discovery, I suppose?
It was a relatively low-stakes operation for the Catholic monarchs. This, to put it in context, what was spent in the expedition that eventually discovers America and that triggers the encounter of civilizations was actually much less than the Catholic monarchs had actually spent for the dowry of their daughter, Catherine of Aragon, for her wedding in England. That is, it was relatively small money. They just provided one big boat, which was the one that Christopher Columbus would captain in this expedition. The other two, the caravels, the two caravels of the Pinzon brothers, were actually sourced for privately by Columbus. It was a relatively low stakes thing to do, and it has to be understood in the context of this frenzy for reestablishing the trade routes with the Far East, with China, with the Indian subcontinent, with Japan, in the context of the presence of the Ottoman Turks in the Mediterranean. That is, the Iberian kingdoms, Portugal in particular, had been doing the circumnavigation of Africa in order to reach the Indian subcontinent for quite a few years. The Kingdom of Castile had already established itself in the Canary Islands, of course, and Christopher Columbus he had this idea. He was a navigator, he was a geographer as well, and he had the idea that it was possible to reach the Far East by means of navigating west. That is, he thought that the Earth was much smaller than it actually was. Of course, he didn't account for the presence of America, which was, of course, unknown in the own world at that time. But it was an expedition that perhaps promised, to find perhaps a few more islands, like the Portuguese had found in the Azores, like the Spaniards had found in the Canaries, and perhaps even the possibility of establishing a new trade route with the Far East. That was the idea. And of course, what was to unfold was unexpected, to say the least.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So you mentioned the big ship that he went on. Am I right in thinking that's the Santa Maria?
Yeah, it was the now Santa Maria. It was the bigger of the three boats, and that was captained by Columbus himself. The other two boats were captained by two local sailors from Huelva, from Palos de la Frontera, where the expedition left, which were the Pinzon brothers. Yeah.
Right. So just delving into the boats a little bit, like the three boats that went there. What sort of do we know about life on board the Santa Maria and those other boats? What was life like for those sailors on board?
Well, very difficult, and very difficult not just because of the logistics of the trip. To give you an idea, they depart from the Canary Islands, from La Gomera, in early September, and the trip to eventually the Bahamas takes over a month. What made it possible, and this is one of the calculations that Columbus got right, was that they departed from as far south as possible. That is, it was much easier to navigate the Ocean Sea, which is the way in which the Atlantic was known back then, from as far south as possible because of the prevailing currents of the Atlantic. So they had departed from Huelva, from Andalusia, and they had restocked in the Canary Islands. And then, that journey took about over a month. It was a very difficult one. And one anecdote that I think is very telling is that Christopher Columbus himself kept a double accountants of the journey itself. That is, he kept a double log, one for himself, in which he annotated the actual distance that they had traveled, and another one for the crew, in which he vastly underestimated how far from shore they actually were, because he knew that there was no way that they could return. So it was a one-way trip, this one. But because he knew that his crew was not particularly well versed in navigation and was not particularly disciplined either, a lot of these people were people who had just left prison. They were criminals in some cases, very poor people. and he knew that there was always the possibility of a rebellion on board. So he tried to, he lied to them basically in order to make sure that that didn't come to pass. They reached the Bahamas on the 12th of October. When they are at the very end of their ability to navigate any farther. So it was a very, very difficult journey.
Yeah, and it seems like the voyage landed at the right time, with obviously supplies running out. They'll have only had so much of everything on board that could sustain the travellers. And that was my next question, actually, where he landed, which you answered there, being the Bahamas. So when he landed, what did he discover when he was there? I think we spoke about, when I did the module at uni, there was 2 different types of tribes people or something as well. So if we could just discuss what he discovered and the types of people that he found, that would be good.
Yes, when he arrives in the island that we believe is Guanani, in one of the small Caribbean islands of what today are the Bahamas, this is an inhabited island, and Columbus and his crew describe the natives as the Taínos, because this is a word that they utilize when they are communicating with the Europeans, with the Christians, with the Spaniards. Taíno in their language meant we are the good people, we are good people, and they seem to communicate in what we can only imagine was perhaps sign language and the body language, that there were people in other islands called the Caribs who were hunting them, who were hurting them, and who were the evil ones. This, of course, was something that was that was very convenient from the point of view of the European, of the Christian mentality, that dichotomy between the noble savage, between the good people, the people who inhabit this sort of paradise on earth, and the evil ones from whom they need protecting. This is something that bodes very well, for instance, with the feudal mentality. Okay, these are people that might need protecting. These are people that might be loyal servants because they are good people. And what we know about that civilization is that it was relatively primitive, had nothing to do with the very advanced and very sophisticated civilizations of the continent that are going to be encountered later on, the Azteca and the Inca in particular. And we also know that this was, an agricultural civilization and a receding civilization as well. That is, it was a civilization that was already receding, that was already much smaller than it had once been, because of the resources that they were utilizing and what the islands could actually provide for them. As we know, with the introduction of European diseases, they are going to be decimated to the point of disappearing. These are the Taínos, those indigenous tribes of the islands of the Caribbean.
Yeah, that's a really sad result of what happened, and sort of foretelling of what was to come later on with European colonialism. But when they arrived and some of the things that they discovered, I seem to remember you mentioning the people who were writing about it, the Spanish people, they had to invent words of things they'd seen, like they'd never seen waterfalls before. I just thought that was an interesting point you might be able to elaborate on.
Yeah, it's fascinating to read the not just the logbooks of Columbus, but also the early chronicles of the natural historians like Oviedo, for instance, and of other chroniclers who find themselves in a situation where they have to describe for the purpose of showing the Catholic monarchs or their sponsors what it is that they are doing and what it is that they and where it is that they are, because they have the beginning. Let's remember, they don't know where they are, and they have to describe those landscapes. They have to describe the fauna. They have to describe the plants that they see, and a lot of these things are new. That is, they don't really have a European framework with which to explain what it is that is in front of them. And quite often they resort to magical language. And obviously, if we jump 4 or 5 centuries into the 20th century and we look at the literature of the boom of Latin American literature, of magic realism, of Garcia Marquez, and all of these authors that present the extraordinary with a very down-to-earth language, a lot of it is actually inspired in the works of the early chronicles of the Conquista. That is, that sense of wonder, because they have discovered a new world, a place that they didn't know existed, and a place that looked very different, can you imagine, from the plains of Castile and Extremadura, where many of them came from, which with these landscapes that you see in central Spain, where it's all, yellow fields as far as the eye can see, the sky, and nothing else. And all of a sudden, all of these places, all of these very exotic places, turn up in front of their eyes, and they seem to lack words really to describe what they are seeing. What they do have is an incredible sense of enthusiasm, which is transmitted into those sources.
That's just incredible. Like, that shows how sort of powerful that was for those people who arrived there, having never seen anything like it in their lives, that they have to resort to this, like you said, this magical language to properly describe it. So upon their return now back to Spain, my next question is, how was Columbus perceived back in Spain and Europe at the time? Was he hailed as a hero, or was he seen as more of a conqueror?
The fate of Columbus was a very common one for many of the conquistadors that were to come later. Columbus himself was not a conquistador; he was a sailor. That's what he was interested in, and in fact, he's criticized by some of the settlers, by some of the people that he brings in his expeditions, because he just wants to keep discovering new islands. He just wants to keep sailing. He doesn't want to settle anywhere. That is because that's where he feels at ease. You know, he's a navigator. He's not a governor. He's not a conquistador. He's not a man of the military. He just wants to keep seeing places, basically, and planting the Castilian standard in those places. That's what he wants to do, because he thinks that that's what his mission is. When he returns, and obviously having been given the responsibility of ruling the places that he's discovering, well, he's found one thing clearly, that is, he's someone who's not a good people leader. Very early on, the Catholic Queen, well, of course, she forbids slavery. She tries to ensure, by means of her testament as well, that the indigenous people are treated with as much love as a Christian is capable of giving, as he writes in her testament. Yet Christopher Columbus doesn't quite follow those guidelines. He's going to antagonize the settlers. He's going to antagonize the clergy, the people who are there, in order to ensure that the orders of the Catholic monarchs are observed. And in fact, he's going to return to Spain after his third voyage as a prisoner. That is, his fortune is very similar to that of other conquistadors. That is, many of them felt entitled, of course, to much more than they were given by the Spanish monarchy. The Spanish monarchy realized that the extent of the power that these people could have in a place that was much bigger than Spain itself was something that the Spanish monarchy needed to control. That is, they needed to ensure that those places were actually ruled from the Iberian Peninsula rather than from the New World itself. And in those dynamics, we have already the beginning of the Creole movements that are going to lead later on, several centuries later, to the movements of independence, which are largely movements of rebellion of the white settlers rather than of the indigenous people against the monarchy, precisely because of those dynamics, where the metropolis tries to rule a centralized empire rather than allowing the settlers to do their own thing.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. You mentioned there how it led to sort of centuries later movements of independence. So I'm just going back a little bit before that, and sort of we've kind of discussed what we can learn from his expedition, but was his expedition a forerunner for early European colonialism? Like, when you look at the sort of 19th century, 18th, 19th century, the scramble for Africa, could you trace that back to like Columbus discovering the Americas? Is that something that's a link can be forged there, or is it just completely different?
When we look in particular at there's a very good historian who passed away fairly recently, John Eliot, who's perhaps the best or one of the very few who have actually taken seriously the task of comparing the Spanish and the British Empire. And he has compiled a series of British sources that tell us very clearly that the British had the experience of the Spaniards very much in mind when it came to the expansion of Great Britain across the world, both as a positive and as a negative example. That is, they paid attention to what problems the Spanish monarchy had in America, and they try to learn from those when it came to their own expeditions. Yes, absolutely. I mean, of course, you have to put some nuance into all of this. No, the British Empire is going to operate through trading companies and so on, and it's going to establish itself in parts of the world that are perhaps much more developed economically than was the case of the Caribbean, for instance, and that leads to very different dynamics. But without question, with 1492, what we have is the first iteration, a fortuitous one at that, the first iteration of Europe expanding itself beyond its own realm, beyond its own continent, without question.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great answer. So I've just got one question left for you, and that would be, what is Christopher Columbus's legacy? What legacy did he leave behind, and how is he perceived today?
Well, a very controversial legacy, as we know, across the world. In the case of America, we have Columbus Day, we have the Dia de la Raza in Mexico, and we have on the 12th of October as well in Spain, still the National Day of Spain, which is also controversial in Spain, as you can expect. The remains of Christopher Columbus today are, most of them, in the mausoleum in the Cathedral of Seville. But before that, they were in Havana, they were in Valladolid, they were in many different places, which tells us, that throughout history, his legacy has been one that has been linked to colonialism. Of course, he's the one who gives name to the concept itself, and also is someone whose legacy has been celebrated by others, as we know. Still, there is a major, both in the USA and in the Hispanic America, there is still a celebration of sorts of the events that took place, but a celebration that's nevertheless very nuanced. That is, I would say that over the past half century or so, and especially after the 5th centenary, after 1992, there's been a revision really of the legacies of Columbus in light of indigenism. And that's how you were referring at the beginning of this interview about the discovery, with quotation marks. They encounter civilization, that perspective of the indigenous, that decolonization of the curriculum that we have in universities right now. That is of course, his legacy remains a very controversial one. Most of the positive aspects that the Spanish Empire left in America were left after Columbus rather than by Columbus. And as such, well, he's a figure that has remained controversial, but nevertheless an incredibly important one, because most events in history tend to happen in circles. That is, they tend to happen several times. One thing that's never going to happen again is the discovery of America, for sure. So that makes it a very unique historical event.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic summary of Christopher Columbus. So just before I stop the recording, just like to place on record, thanks to Carlos for coming on. You've been a fantastic guest, and it's a privilege to have you on. So an academic who's so well respected in the field, and you're a great lecturer at uni as well. So I'd just like to say thanks again, Carlos, for coming on.
Thanks to you. You were a fantastic student as well, and I'm really glad that you're doing this. It's super entertaining.
Thank you very much. Cheers. So that's it for this episode, everyone. We'll catch you at the next one. Cheers. Bye.